It's nice to be here and to talk about this question. Surely you don't expect me to believe in miracles? And the answer is yes, I do. I'm going to try and persuade you to believe in them. Obviously, you know that. You've been invited by a Christian friend maybe, or you know about this church. That will be my argument today. But as I say, it didn't used to be my view. So when I started at university, I was very skeptical, cynical about Christians. I even wrote a poem, age 18, to express my contempt for Christianity. And you have to understand that I was studying natural sciences, not English literature. So my poem is of somewhat limited merit. But I still can remember it. It goes like this. Some folks seem to find it odd that people grow from tiny cells. Pathetic, those who think of God and still drop coins in wishing wells. There we are. That was my contribution to the canon of English poetry. But, the idea of the poem was, is it that they don't understand biology? Can they not understand the basics of science? I mean, sure, there was a time that people thought that it rained because God had a giant watering can in the sky. But then we figured out evaporation and condensation and the water cycle. People used to think that you got ill because of demons and you got better because of miracles. And then we came to understand about bacteria and viruses and immunoglobulin and helper T cells and the immune system. So surely now we've put people on the moon, now we've sequenced the human genome, it's time to throw away these superstitions. And miracles were just the absolute, it was the nail in the coffin as far as I was concerned, because I'm going to try and persuade you today to look at, in fact, all my examples are going to come from this book. This is a compilation of eyewitness testimony from the time of Jesus. So it's a 2,000-year-old text, which makes it really the most useful text for understanding about Jesus. You want to get a text that goes back to the people who actually knew him and met him and recorded what they saw. So this is part of the Bible, but it's just available separately, one of the documents about Jesus. I'm going to try and persuade you to take this home and read it. But if you do, it won't be long before you come across a miracle. Let me read you an example. Jesus went to Capernaum, a city of Galilee. So this is in the north of Israel. He left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they appealed to Jesus on her behalf. He stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. What an interesting verb to use. It wasn't that he performed some medicine. He just told the fever off. You naughty fever. Now you must go at once. And it did. And she immediately rose and began to serve them. When the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him. He laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. You probably heard of these stories of Jesus as a miraculous healer. And that may be enough for you, as it was for me, to dismiss the whole thing. Obviously, this can't have happened. And it bears those hallmarks of exaggeration and fantasy, and here's a load of Christians sort of writing up their leader in a sensational way. Well, I'm going to start with the cynic. If that's you, then I hope this will engage you. I was dismissive, and I think for two main reasons, and hopefully you've got a little sheet here which has the outline of where I'm going. These were the two main reasons that I was dismissive. Firstly, I thought this is scientifically impossible. I mean, I guess you can heal people scientifically if you get lucky with the right remedy, but you cannot walk on water scientifically. I mean, unless the sea's frozen, which it wouldn't have been in the Middle East. So you can't do that. Or you can't feed 5,000 people with 5 bread rolls and then collect up afterwards more leftovers than you started with. That's how the narrative of the feeding of the 5,000 is described. Jesus shares out a tiny amount of food and then collects up leftover food, and there's more leftovers than they started with. You can't do that scientifically. In fact, I used to, for a bit of fun, try and work out which of the miracles in the Bible would be the most problematic scientifically. And if you are a scientist, you might enjoy this sort of thought experiment. So a healing, I mean, I guess that's conceivable. The bacterial infection just dies off. Your immune system gets lucky. Walking on the water is pretty difficult. I reckon two of the hardest ones in the Old Testament in the Bible. There's an episode where a shadow on some steps goes backwards, and to make a shadow go back, it might sound easy, but basically you've got to either start spinning the earth the other way, or you have to change, the way light bends, both of which are seriously problematic. I teach part-time on a Bible college course, and we get all kinds of people on it who are wanting to know more about the Bible to serve in their churches. And last year we had a guy who was a theoretical astrophysicist from Cambridge. In fact, I did an event a bit like this with him, and the question was, how can an astrophysicist believe in God? And he's brilliant because not only did he know a lot about astrophysics, but also he was just a geek, so he just loved all these questions. So I said to him, what would happen if you started spinning the Earth backwards on its axis? Basically, very, very bad things would happen. So you can't do that. Scientifically impossible. Game over. But I now realize, I think, that I was a bit naive in my atheism by kind of not being aware of the assumptions that I was bringing to the question by faith, if I can say it that way. I didn't think I had faith. I was a skeptic about faith. But by faith in my atheism, because of prior commitments that I had that I hadn't proved, but I brought with me to the question, the baggage that I had, I didn't view things as objectively as I thought. My logic basically went like this. Number one, there is no God. As Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, said, mankind is nothing but a chance collocation of atoms on a minor speck of interstellar dust. That's what I thought about humans. We're here by accident. The Big Bang happened by accident. Human evolution happened by accident. Here we are. There's no God. If there's no God, then there is nobody to mess with the laws of physics. They must be inviolable. They can never be changed. They're immutable. Therefore, when the Bible describes things that involve the messing with the laws of physics, it must be lying. Yeah, it's a pretty clear logic. It's a pretty clear logic if my starting point was correct. I hadn't proved there was no God. I just assumed there was no God. And then I derived everything else in the equation from that. And I want to say that isn't necessarily objective. Like, what if I was wrong about that? Let's just run the experiment a different way. What if there is a God? I know maybe you don't think there is, but what if there were one? What if we're not here by accident? We're here because he powerfully created the world, the universe. What if the laws of physics are actually a description of God's orderly way of sustaining the universe? When the Bible describes a miracle, it must be that God decided on a certain day of the week to sustain the universe in a slightly different way. Now, both of those are entirely consistent, I think, logically, philosophically. The question is, which starting point do you hold to, which do you begin with? And I want to say a little bit about how science actually works so that we don't have sort of overreach in our use of science. So sometimes people speak as though science is automatically atheistic. And of course it never was. Like the early scientists, most of them were Christians, in Britain at any rate. People like Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell and Charles Babbage and Louis Pasteur and so on. All committed Christians. And it was their belief in a God who'd ordered the world that made them go looking for order in the world. I mean, they didn't think the world was random. They thought that God had designed it and upheld it in a clever way. So that's what motivated Johannes Kepler to look through his telescope and work out the elliptical orbits of planets, because he thought that God liked elliptical equations, which I guess he does. So he was fascinated with the world that, as he saw it, was designed by God. And as he was looking through his telescope at the planets, he observed that God sustains the universe in a very consistent way. Like every day of the week, God keeps the laws of physics going just in the same way as they were every other day of the week. So to give a simple example, the acceleration on the Earth's surface due to gravity is 9.81 meters per second per second. So if you throw one of the olives in your bowl at somebody across the room, how fast it goes horizontally will depend on how good you are at throwing, but it will accelerate towards the floor at 9.81 meters per second per second. And it's the same with olives thrown in any country on the Earth's surface. So if people in Greece have an argument and they have an olive fight, it'll be the same. If you drop an olive from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it'll be the same. That's just because God likes consistency. I would suggest there's nothing in principle to stop God, if he wanted to, one day changing the value of the underlying gravitational constant. Now, I know there are some days when it really does seem that God has turned the knob of gravity up a bit when you're lying pinned to your bed and it feels much harder to get up than usual. But God doesn't do that. He keeps it the same. But I put here on the handout, point 1, observed uniformity does not constrain divine possibility. What I mean is this: the fact that we observe every single time we check 9.81 meters per second, 9.81 meters per second every day doesn't mean that God couldn't make it 10.81 meters per second. He just doesn't. Now, it's quite interesting, actually. One of the philosophical arguments against miracles, the most famous one, comes from the Scottish philosopher David Hume, the Scottish skeptic. And he argued against miracles famously, saying, no amount of evidence would ever be enough to persuade you of something as unlikely as a miracle. So that the burden of proof would be infinite on the Christian. And so he said, I don't believe in them. Fair enough, he's a famous skeptic. But the other thing he argued, which people often don't speak about, was he argued against the whole principle of induction on which all logic and science is based. The principle of induction says that the future will be like the past. So I know how much olives weigh today, I know how much they weighed yesterday, I know how much they weighed the day before that, so I'm assuming that that's what olives will weigh tomorrow. But you don't know that, do you? I mean, I know the sun rose today, I know that the speed of light was such and such today, and I'm assuming it will be the same tomorrow. And David Hume, ultra-skeptically, said, well, how do you know that? And he actually attacked the whole basis of rationality. And philosophers have really struggled to answer him, actually. So if you study philosophy at university, this is one of the big problems. Why should the future be like the past? How do you get over Hume's critique of induction? And I would say, as a Christian, well, you get past it by saying that the future will be like the past because there's a God who's consistent. He likes to sustain the world in an orderly way. And so all of the order that we observe in science is like the neatness, if you like, of God's tidy mind. It's his love of geometry and mathematics and biology and order and consistency. But that doesn't mean that God couldn't, in principle, if he wanted to, do something different. In fact, I'd argue that isn't that exactly what you would expect God to do if he needed to get our attention? Just imagine, you're God, and you come on a rescue mission to this broken world. And so you're born as a human baby in Bethlehem at Christmas, and you grow up and you think, I'm now ready to launch my rescue mission. And I'm going to turn up and say, hi, I'm God. I made the world, and I've come to rescue you. And people are going to go, I don't think you are. No, really, no, I'm God. No, I think you need to go and see a psychiatrist, mate, right? And sooner or later, somebody would challenge you saying, well, go on, prove it then. Prove it. Do something that only God could do. Oh, no, I can't do that. Obviously, I'm constrained by the laws of physics, just like everybody else is, but trust me, I'm God. At this point, you laugh me out of court, don't you? But surely, if at the central turning point of history, when God comes to earth on his rescue mission, and he needs to authenticate that, wouldn't you expect him to do something slightly unusual? If there's not a God, it's impossible for there to be a miracle. If there is a God, it's possible, but just unusual. That's the whole point about miracles, is they're unusual, isn't it? If a third of people who die are alive again 3 days later, then the resurrection of Jesus is no big deal. You know, if half the time you get out of a dinghy in the sea, you just walk to shore on the surface, then walking in water is no big deal. But the point is that never, ever happens usually. Of course, there's an observed uniformity about the world that says this is not normal. And so when Jesus does it, it gets everyone's attention. Now, if you dismiss miracles on grounds number one, I want to say it's just because you've made assumptions about the nature of the world. You brought to the question your prior commitment to the faith of atheism, and so you've ruled it out. And I want to say, are you open to the possibility that your starting point was wrong? if there is a God, he could do this if he wanted to. Okay, that's point one. But point two, but did he though? I mean, I get the thought experiment. In theory, a divine being who ran the world could do something unusual. He could sort of twist the dials of physics in a different way. In principle, he could. But did he, of course? That's the second question. Is there historical evidence to say that this actually happened? Point two. Is it historically unpersuasive? And I want to give some examples of a whole load of miracles and some features I've noticed about them. And really, I'd love you to read them for yourself. So they're all in here, but have a look. But you'll find that lots of Jesus' miracles are, firstly, public. So I could tell you that in the Forest of Dean in 1991, in the depth of winter when no one else was around, I levitated a fox for 35 seconds. It was amazing. And already, I mean, you're laughing because you're thinking, I don't think you did. Okay, I didn't. I lied, right? But there's no witnesses, so I could say anything. And there are some major religions in the world that are based on claims like that, where there are no witnesses. I don't want to offend anybody by it. You can probably work it out. People meeting angels, apparently nobody else there to testify to it. I'm just skeptical about that. Did you really meet the angel? Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, are you sure you did? Whereas Jesus' miracles, they happen in public, and not just in public, but in named places. I've just read about what happened in Capernaum, which is a town in the north of Israel near the Sea of Galilee, which I've been to. The excavations of it still standing. That was where this happened. And apparently, Jesus healed everybody who was ill with anything. Now, it seems to me that's the sort of thing that people in Capernaum are going to know about. This is a public, all of the sick people in this little town of Capernaum. Now, the trouble with naming Capernaum in this document is the skeptics can check. And we can't check now because it was a long time ago. But the skeptics of the first century, and there were lots of skeptics, when the message of Christianity was first preached, there were lots of skeptics. Very easy to debunk it, isn't it, if you name the place? Everyone knows that the best fairy stories are set long, long ago, far, far away, because no one can check. But to say it's in Capernaum, it's a disaster. Easily debunked. Just go to the Capernaum, excuse me, did this happen in your town? Oh no, I've never heard of that. It's over. And of course, all the way through the gospel, we know places, we know events, they happened publicly. Take Jesus' crucifixion, for example, in Jerusalem, the capital city, with a sign written in multiple languages, Latin and Greek and Aramaic. All the passers-by could go past and mock those who were being killed by crucifixion. Everybody saw it. It's public. And then the empty tomb and the body disappeared. And then Jesus appearing to multiple witnesses. It's public. It wasn't done in a corner. Secondly, I find this one fascinating. Uncontested. By which I mean this, that Jesus' opponents, they oppose him, but they think that he did the miracles. Now, that's quite interesting to me, because if I was a modern atheist opponent of Jesus, I'd just say it didn't happen. But the first century opponents of Jesus said, oh, it did happen, but it was the devil that did it. Now, that's kind of interesting to me as an objection, because it means they kind of realize that they've lost on the did it happen or not front. In fact, it goes even further than that. Sometimes they make the very fact that Jesus did a miracle the basis for their accusation against him. If you know any Jewish theology, you'll know that in the Ten Commandments, God had said that one day a week, a Saturday, the Sabbath day, was to be a day of rest. And Jesus was a Jewish teacher, and all of his followers were Jewish. And then he started healing people, including on Saturdays. You can find an example in here in chapter 13 if you read it later. And they don't dispute that Jesus did this miracle on a Saturday. Rather, they make the very fact that he did it the basis for their charge against him. You're not supposed to do healings on Saturdays, Jesus. You're breaking the Ten Commandments. I mean, he's not breaking the Ten Commandments. It's just a ludicrous interpretation of the law, but they're just being silly about it. But the point is, even his opponents think he did it, uncontested. Thirdly, responsive. So if I wanted, someone asked, is there going to be a miracle tonight? And I'm afraid there's not. But if I was going to do one, let me tell you, it would involve a stooge and probably a bit of money changing hands. I say, like, I'm doing this talk on miracles. I don't want to look bad, so do you mind sort of hobbling in and I'll give you, I'll heal you, and then you dance out, okay, and I'll give you 20 quid? And so I said, okay, sure. You can imagine setting up some of these miracles. But it doesn't really work with Jesus because often his miracles happen in response to situations that he can't set up. Like, for example, a man born blind. I mean, how do you do that one? Like, excuse me, do you mind pretending to be blind for like your entire life so that your parents are totally convinced and everyone in the town's... And then I'll heal you. Like, okay, sure. You can't set that up. Or the resurrection. Like, how about you kill me and then afterwards you can't do it. Responsive. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourthly, surprising. And what I mean by this is, when a miracle happens in the first century, and you can read about them here, people don't respond the way that credulous, unscientific fools would respond. That's what I thought about them in my arrogance. I thought, well, of course, they don't know any biology, do they? Bless them, that's why. You don't have to know a lot of biology to know that when someone's dead for 3 days, you're not going to see them again. You just got to bury some people and live in this world for long enough. And you know that dead people don't ever come back. You figure that out. You don't have to know a lot about physics to know that walking on water isn't what happens when someone gets out of a boat. You just have to be a fisherman. Right? They've got the basics figured out. And so when it happens, they don't go, oh, well, since we live in a fairy tale world, hooray, what a lovely fairy tale. They're frightened. And they're astonished. And they're like, what's just happened here? They can't believe it. Which is exactly how I'd expect a real response to work. Read the account of the resurrection of Jesus at the very end of this book. And they're quite surprised, understatement. And they take a lot of persuasion. People say, oh, Jesus is back from the dead. I don't think so, because he was dead. And then with cumulative evidence, they're finally persuaded it's true. In fact, that's one of my favorite miracles. I mean, it's the biggest miracle, I guess, but it's one of my favorite bits of evidence because it's so mundane. Jesus appears to them after he's been dead. They are very surprised, understatement, and they think they've seen a ghost or a spirit or a vision. Like, it can't actually be him because he can't be physically him because he was dead. And so he says, have you got any fish? It's a very mundane test, isn't it? But give me a bit of fish and I'll eat it for you. I love that because if you wake up in the middle of the night and there's someone in your bedroom, and you think, I think this is my wife or my husband, but I'm not sure, it could be a ghost, and you want to just check it this way, give them some fish. I mean, they probably don't want to eat fish at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the point is, what would it look like if a ghost ate fish? I don't believe in ghosts, I'm being silly, but I guess the fish would just fall to the floor, wouldn't it? Because, or it's just, the fish would pass through them like floating. But if you eat fish and the fish disappears, it means it's gone into a physical mouth. It's such a mundane, simple thing, but it's actually very, very good evidence that this man that they're meeting, who has the execution scars in his hands and side, is the person that they killed. Although they're surprised by it, they're not credulous. And then finally, explained, Jesus doesn't do sort of arbitrarily pointless miracles. People sometimes say, if God's there, then he needs to write in the sky right now, hello, Sandra, I'm here, or something, whatever. You fill in your name. And people make demands for these sort of, God's got to dance to my tune, jump through my hoops kind of expectation. And God won't do it. And that's because God isn't a genie. He's not there just to do gratuitous party tricks at our whim. No, Jesus' miracles, actually, they're all purposeful, because he's trying to signify something particular. Not just that he's powerful, but that he's the rescuer. He's come to sort the world out. He's come to save us from all that's wrong, from disease and evil and death. And so he does miracles like exorcising evil spirits, because evil has no place in a world that is fixed. and healing sickness, because sickness really spoils the world, as I can tell you with one of my stepsisters just out of intensive care and the other one on chemo. Sickness messes up the world, so a rescuer's got to be able to sort out sickness. And death, if you've been separated from someone you love, that's got to be dealt with. And so Jesus doesn't just do party trick miracles, he does miracles that prove in principle that he can sort the world out as its rescuer. You'll see that my 5 points of point 2 make an acrostic. Public, uncontested, response, surprising, and explained. It's the acrostic PERSE, which is slightly unfortunate, isn't it? It makes you think of those dodgy televangelists who do miracles for a quick buck and it's all faked. It just happened to fall out that way. And I said to someone years ago, I was doing an earlier version of this talk, I said, I've just come up with this acrostic and it spells PERSE. It's not really ideal. Can you think of anything better? She said, well, Andrew, you do know that PERSE is an anagram of super. Much better. So if you want to remember it, it's surprising, uncontested, public, explained, and responsive. Good reasons, I think, to take this data seriously, provided, of course, that you haven't already pre-decided, because of your commitment to atheism, that you're going to throw the evidence out. In the Richard Dawkins book, I know he now calls himself a Christian, not an actual Christian, he believes it, but a cultural Christian, because he likes all of the trappings of Christianity without the reality of it. But Richard Dawkins says in his famous book, The God Delusion, that the resurrection did not happen because it would be a contradiction of the laws of physics. That's exactly the kind of circular logic I'm trying to attack this evening. Because the laws of physics don't require that there's no resurrection. The laws of physics just say in the universe that we describe day by day, resurrections don't happen. Like, of course they don't. The Christians know that as well. That's why the day on which a resurrection did happen is kind of a big deal. The scientific method, of course, it always advances by the bit of data that doesn't fit the theory. That's interesting. I would have predicted this, but I found that. And what you don't do in science is throw out the bit of data that doesn't fit your theory. That's a sure way of holding on to a bad theory. I think the atheist theory does have to go if there was a resurrection. Are you willing to let it go? Or is your faith in it so strong that it's not even up for grabs? And then finally, how am I doing for time? I need to stop so you can ask questions. But let me finally bring you to this. Consider things objectively and subjectively. Here's a little excerpt from Luke's Gospel. The disciples of John was a very famous preacher, John the Baptist, contemporary of Jesus. The disciples of John the Baptist reported all the things that had been going on to him. And John, calling 2 of his disciples to him, sent them to the Lord Jesus, saying, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And when the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" That's the key question. In other words, are you the Messiah that we're looking forward to? In that hour, Jesus healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits. On many who were blind, he bestowed sight. He answered them, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who's not offended by me." It seems to me this is a very, very persuasive answer. I'm not going to tell you that I'm the Messiah. I invite you just to report the things of which you are witnesses, the things you've seen and heard. And on the basis of that evidence, you decide. I submit to you that if you saw someone in London going to Moorfields Eye Hospital and suddenly everyone can see, they're all discharged. They go to Guy's Hospital, the oncology ward is emptied. I submit to you that you would take that person quite seriously. That's all Jesus asked us to do, to consider the evidence objectively. But notice and I'm making the same point I made at the beginning, we're never coming to this neutrally as a question. If you come as an atheist, you're going to get stuck. You start by saying, given miracles are impossible, did this miracle happen? You smuggled in your conclusion with your premise. But notice that John the Baptist had a different starting point. He believed there was a God. He believed there was a God of incredible power who had promised to send a savior, a rescuer. And so his question isn't, is it possible in principle for there to be a miracle? His question is, are you the rescuer we've been expecting? And actually, the promises of the Jewish scriptures had described the coming rescuer as one who would, it's in the prophet Isaiah, some 800 years before Jesus, specified that the rescuer would open the eyes of the blind and unstop the ears of the deaf and preach good news to the poor. And Jesus said, well, just say what you've seen and heard. I think you'll find it matches what you were longing for. The God who promised to rescue, he sent one. But then this little interesting final line of the paragraph I printed out for you. Blessed is the one who's not offended by me. I've put here, consider things objectively and subjectively. I think objectively the evidence I find overwhelming. But Jesus isn't so naive as to think that all of us are going to be convinced by that. Because he knows something else is going on subjectively. I'm just going to read you one final little bit from how this goes on. We read this. When all the people heard Jesus, and the tax collectors too, tax collectors in those days were despised traitors. They were Jewish people working for the occupying Romans. People hated them. They made their money by overcharging people. When the people heard this, and the low-life tax collectors, they declared God righteous, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers, the religious people, the experts in religion, they rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. Years ago there was that scandal with Cambridge Analytica, harvesting data from Facebook and using it to profile us. And we now realize the power of big data. You can use big data to work out how you voted today in the mayoral election without even seeing your voting paper, probably. It turns out the biggest predictor of whether or not someone embraced Jesus was whether they'd been baptized by John the Baptist or not. Interesting, isn't it? The tax collectors, the lowlifes, they got baptized. They welcomed this message. And the religious experts, they weren't baptized and they hated this message. Now, you need to understand, to get this, what baptism is about. Baptism, Christian baptism, it symbolized saying, I am morally filthy and I need a wash. It's basically what it was about. John the Baptist, he invited people to repent, to turn away from evil, and to get baptized. And some people said, I need that. I know that I've messed my life up and I need a rescuer. And I'm prepared to have a bath publicly to declare this. People like that, they loved Jesus. They embraced his message. But interestingly, the religious people, that's who it was. The bishops, the theologians, the ministers like me. Oh, I don't need a bath. I'm a very respectable, upright person. I don't think I need that. And so they didn't get baptized by John. And so they hated Jesus. And so right in the middle of this eyewitness document, we got objective data. The blind can see, the lame can walk, what you've seen and heard. But just an acknowledgement that whether or not you're convinced, it might end up saying as much about you as it says about the evidence. Are you someone willing to say, I could do with some help in my life. I'm in a bit of a mess morally. If God sent a rescuer, I'm quite interested in that. Of course, combined with the evidence. You don't want to believe in a rescuer that isn't real. You've got to have evidence behind it. But those people end up on a journey that takes them to Jesus. And there's other people, not for scientific grounds, not for evidence grounds, but just because of the fact that they're insulted at the very insinuation that they could do with some help. No thanks. I don't need God's charity, and I do not need a saviour. And those people will tend to find a reason to dismiss the whole thing. Hey, I've spoken for too long, really, so thank you for your time. And we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to have just 2 minutes now to submit any questions that you want to, and we'll have time to answer a few of those questions. So I can see some have come in. Why don't we just take a couple of minutes? You may want to vote on the ones that have already appeared, and I'll get Andrew up in a moment. Let's draw back together there, if we may. Thanks for your questions. Some great questions there. We'll aim to get through all of them quickly. But if we don't, do come and grab Andrew at the end. First question, why didn't Jesus appear to more people like his enemies to prove his resurrection more widely?
I think I dispute the premise. I think Jesus' resurrection was public. It was witnessed by a whole load of different people at different times. He appeared to Cephas. He appeared to the 12 apostles. He appeared to more than 5,000 at one point, all at the same time. He appeared to James. He appeared to all the apostles together. He appeared to Paul. So there's a whole load of resurrection appearances to different people, sometimes to crowds. And when the first Christian sermon was preached in Jerusalem, the city where they killed Jesus, a month later, the day of Pentecost, Peter begins by saying, Jesus of Nazareth was a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, as you yourselves know. That wasn't the thing he was arguing for. That was the premise on which he was arguing. Everybody knew this. It was so widely known in Jerusalem. So I think it was widely known. But the other thing about the question I want to challenge is the idea that enough evidence would persuade somebody, and therefore somebody not being persuaded must be because the evidence wasn't enough. And as I said, there were instances in Jesus' life where he met people with and did a miracle before their eyes, and then they make the fact he did it on a Saturday the reason to reject him. They think it happened. So it's simply not the case that enough evidence of a miracle makes somebody a Christian. If we've got this hostility for Jesus for other reasons, we'll find a reason to hold out against him.
You spoke about how atheists come from a biased point of view. Do you not think that the Bible is an incredible biased source to believe the miracles?
Yes, the Bible is gloriously biased. And in fact, so are pretty much all texts, right? Because people don't bother to write texts unless they believe in them, so they're biased. So I sometimes say to people, as a joke, you shouldn't believe in medical textbooks written by doctors, because the doctors believe in them. They're biased. Like obviously, you write things that you believe in. The question isn't did they believe in it. The question is did they lie in order to say it. And I don't think they're lying, but they definitely believe in it. That's why they bother. That's why the early Christians sometimes were persecuted or martyred for saying it. So, but I guess the question really is, given that we're not as objective as we claim, am I willing to test even my own starting point? So I'm not saying you must believe me because I'm a Christian I'm telling you to, and an atheist says you must believe in me because I'm an atheist I'm telling you to. I'm just saying recognize that here are two different perspectives. Have you considered them both? That's what I'm asking for. But don't think I am being totally objective because I'm starting by assuming there's not a God. It's not a neutral starting point. What if there is a God and you got the whole equation wrong? So I'd say, what should an objective person do? You should say, what's the evidence of this miracle? Because I'm still trying to work out if there's a God or not. And if this miracle happened, I guess there must be a God. And if the miracle didn't happen, maybe there isn't a God. But you've got both alive possibilities. I think that's more open-minded, more objective, than if you say, I've already decided miracles can't happen because I'm an atheist, and now I'm not listening anymore. I don't think that's an objective way to proceed.
Isn't it circular reasoning to come to your conclusions basically from the Bible? All major religions claim miracles.
I don't think it's circular. I'm just admitting I've got a different starting point and I'm fitting it with different evidence. So my starting point is like here in the passage, are you the one who is to come? or should we look for another? So the starting point is, there is somebody who is to come. Is this him? That's not circular. That's just saying I've got a starting point and I'm seeing if the evidence fits with it. And I'm just asking you to be honest about that. If your starting point is atheism, the evidence doesn't fit. If your starting point is there's a God, the evidence could fit. Are you willing to investigate both of those possibilities? And it comes from the Bible. The Bible isn't, it's now a thing because people have invented books. But when it was written, people hadn't invented books and therefore it didn't exist. So originally, there was a whole load of different scrolls, different documents, different witnesses. This is one of them. This was originally in one scroll, the scroll of Luke. There's a whole load of others. And then when somebody invented books, they thought, it turns out you can have a lot of scrolls that you put together in an anthology, and you just sew them down the middle, and then you can turn pages, and that was a novelty. So now books have been invented. People have put all the scrolls in the same one. Here tonight, we've just got one of the scrolls on its own. But the Bible is actually a whole collection of different texts from the time of Jesus, giving us access to the question of what actually happened. What do people see? What do people hear? What do the witnesses say? And I think, therefore, it's a very good place to start asking a historical question. But, have a look at it. Take it and have a look if you've not done that before.
If Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, why don't more Jewish people believe in him?
This is a really, really good question. It's worth saying, by the way, that all of the early Christians were Jews. So, sometimes people say Christianity is anti-Semitic, which would be very, very stupid. And I'm sure there are people who, in the name of Jesus, have been anti-Semitic. That's really pretty stupid. Jesus is Jewish. All of his followers are Jewish. Pretty much everyone you meet in here, with a couple of exceptions, is Jewish. So it begun, the followers of Jesus begun amongst the Jewish people, and then many others joined. And that's the church nowadays is a mixture of Jewish people and non-Jewish people. But good question. If Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, how come everybody doesn't follow him? And it's the same question of, are you offended, I think, by Jesus' offer of a rescuer? So some of the religious experts of the day, some of the Jewish leaders, they found that very condescending. I don't need saving. I've lived a moral, upright life. I don't need your charity, God. And on the whole, those religious people, took exception to Jesus. Whereas those who'd say, I've messed up, I'm morally dirty, I need a bath, baptism, they embraced Jesus.
I'm going to put a couple of questions together. What's your view on Catholic miracles and saints? And can mankind perform miracles? Similar questions.
Yeah, I think miracles, I'm quite skeptical. I'm not skeptical about being a Christian. I'm now a Christian, but I'm still skeptical in that I think there are still people in the world trying to pull wool over your eyes. And I think a bit of skepticism is quite healthy, especially if you have email. If you get the email that says, congratulations, you have won, like you probably haven't. I'm skeptical about Catholic miracles. I'm skeptical about the American televangelist miracles. I think there are stooges. I think there are setups. I think there are exaggerations. I want you to test the claims carefully. And tonight's not an invitation to be gullible. Tonight is an invitation to be intellectually careful. So have a look at it and check it out. If you think that these were made up, please dismiss Christianity. I don't think they were made up, and I don't think you can explain them that way. But I'd be pretty skeptical about, somebody went to Norfolk and met the Virgin Mary and now they're healed. I'm pretty skeptical about that, to be honest. Can people do miracles? And the answer is no. That's the whole point, right? Miracles are ordinarily not possible unless the God who made the universe messes around with the physics. And sort of by definition, he does that very, very unusually. That's why it's a miracle. That's why it gets our attention. It's not how he usually runs the science.
Time for one more. There are a few that we've not touched on. Please do grab Andrew if you'd like to ask. What is the need for this rescuer? Why is Jesus relevant for my life today?
This is very connected to the question of whether people in the first century wanted to be baptized or not. So, I mentioned that those who sit in baptism stood for that moral filth and the need for a bath. And some people embraced it and some people didn't. I think that's the same today, isn't it? If you think, my life's fine, if there is a God, I'm going to brazenly stand before him on Judgment Day and say, I've done enough, I've been a good bloke, then, good luck. If you say, if there is a God, I'm in all sorts of trouble. There are the things in my life of which I'm ashamed. There are the things that aren't right with our world. And then Jesus is offering rescue. I reckon you'll run into his arms for it at that point. So it says more about us. In fact, if this is your last question, I'm going to end with my most humorous quote, which I love. There was George Whitefield was a famous preacher in the 18th century, and his sponsor, the Countess of Huntingdon. She was a countess, she was a Christian, and she invited a friend of hers to talk a bit like this. And the friend in question was the Duchess of Buckingham. I don't know if there's any duchesses here tonight, but the Countess of Huntingdon, a Christian aristocrat, invited a duchess to a talk. And we have the letter that the Duchess of Buckingham wrote back declining the invitation. And it goes like this, and I find it amusing, so I learnt it. My dear ladyship, I thank you for your invitation to attend the Methodist preachers. Their doctrines are most repulsive, being strongly tinctured with impertinence in perpetually endeavoring to level all ranks and do away with all distinction. It is a monstrous thing to be told that your heart is as wicked as the common wretches that crawl on the earth. And I cannot but wonder that your ladyship should relish such sentiments, so obviously at variance with good breeding. And it's amusing because it's so rude and so arrogant. But that's the person who doesn't like Jesus because they're just insulted at the suggestion that they need any help. Why would I need that? The common wretches that crawl on the earth, that they might need it, I certainly don't. If that's you won't be interested. Jesus predicts you will not be trusting him, following him. But if you're here and saying, look, the world's a mess, and my life's a mess, maybe in hidden ways, not everybody knows, but there are things that standing before God on the judgment day, I wouldn't know where to look. And Jesus is offering you rescue. I think that's pretty good news. And of course, you've got to find out if it's true. I'm not saying believe it because it sounds nice, but if there's that combination of this is true objectively and it is what I need subjectively, then you'll want to come to Jesus. Thank you.
Andrew, thanks so much indeed. Do grab a seat.